Welcome to week 2 of Group and Organisational Communication. Today we're going to be talking about classical theory, which is a theory that emerged out of the Industrial Revolution, which is the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. But we're going to be considering how classical theory is actually a useful lens through which to consider organisation today, a certain kind of organisation. Before we get into that, let's just remind ourselves what we looked at in week 1. We considered communication models, the various models that you would have come across as communication students, and also we considered this idea of the models that are constitutive of organisation, communication that is constitutive of organisation, and the models that we could possibly imagine that would fall within that category. We ended as well the first lecture with this definition for communication from Van Ruler, which says that communication itself is omnidirectional diachronic. And the reason that's useful when thinking about organisation is because when we're thinking about organisation, and as I said in that first lecture, this notion of organising, we're always having to think about the ways in which the unit that is built up is continually being remade, renegotiated, remanufactured through the communication process in part. Those people who view the primacy of the constitutive models also view the communication process as being primary in the construction of organisation, and that's where we left. That's where we left ourselves at the end of week 1. So moving on to the new material today. In talking of classical theory, or modern theory, or traditional theory, these are some of the other terms that are associated with it. It should be noted that the term is really an umbrella for a theoretical orientation and an explanation, therefore, for the way organisation was working. And the reason that the Industrial Revolution is cited as that time point or time period in which classical theory emerged is because it coincides with the fact that people started to work differently, and therefore their communication was impacted. And so what I've shown on the slide is an illustration of bread on the left, indicating the kind of artisanal business where everything was done by an individual. All of the processes were done by an individual, and they were responsible for the whole process, from actually in the case of bread making, maybe collecting the flour, maybe even grinding the flour, making the flour, milling it, but let's say taking the flour and creating the bread. And then they would have been responsible in their business most likely for baking it and actually selling it. So the communication processes that would have been involved in that kind of organisation, even if it were a small business, would mean that everybody pretty much did everything, had all of the different kind of functions that made the organisation work, or the ways in which it operated. Now, at the time of the Industrial Revolution, things started to become mechanized, and we already know, probably from general reading, the idea that people's roles became much narrower, and they became therefore much more specific, and we have this idea of the production line, or the chain of production. And so, as you can see on the right, you see an individual who's operating a piece of machinery, and you can imagine the impact that the change in the role had in communication. So classical theory, contains a number of theoretical orientations, as I said, and it's particularly associated with three theorists that we hear and read a lot about in the literature. Those three theorists are FAYOL, Weber and Taylor. One is French, the other German, and the last American. And they have very specific ways, and I would say they are connected ways in which we can see how communication may have been impacted as a result of the change in organisational structure. You can see from this slide three particular production type environments in which goods and services are provided to us. So if we're thinking about organisation and business in particular, so we're looking at a clothing business, a food business, kind of production business, manufacturing, and a warehouse of some sort, we can immediately imagine from these pictures alone the kinds of things that have happened within the actual production houses, if you like, for those goods to get to us. And as a result of all of the things that happen and the kind of parallels that you would end up needing in an organization that's actually producing on the volumes that we think about today, and across the different kind of markets that we think about today, with the different kind of tastes that we have, you can imagine how communication actually has been impacted within those actual organizations. And as I said, there are all manner of ways in which people in these businesses and organizations would function in ways that are different to the artisan. I am using from Catherine Miller's text, Organisational Communication, Approaches and Processes, which I've listed in the course materials. I'm using from her this idea that the machine metaphor is a really useful one when considering classical theory. I just want to read something from the text. She says, the Industrial Revolution had profound impacts on how people worked and even on how they thought about work. And therefore it's not surprising that a machine metaphor is central to the classical organisational theories when we start to think about the fact that the Industrial Revolution was the time period in which the ways in which people work changed. So she notes that the classical theorists share a dedication to the machine metaphor, and she asks, what does this metaphor suggest about organisations? What can we learn by considering the ways in which organisations are like machines? And then she suggests that there are many detailed answers to the questions when looking at FAYOL, Weber and Taylor. And those are the three theorists we're going to be looking at today. So one of the aspects of the machine metaphor that is important is this idea of specialization, this idea of an individual in their role having a specific function. So I've used the image of the surgeons around the operating table. You know, within a team, within a small group, those individuals have very specific functions. And it's possible that they have overlapping knowledge and overlapping skills that one could take over for another person. But it's really important, as you can imagine, in that kind of technical role, for people to have a very distinct and discrete knowledge, and therefore help the process by moving it along. And so we can think about specialization in all kinds of different organizations. The middle image really points to this idea of standardization. Now, this female builder is performing a particular function. She is no doubt a specialist in her field, but she's actually part of a bigger machinery that's, you know, performing a particular function. And I think from the image she's actually military, and therefore she has a very specific role to serve, and it could be any kind of role, from one that's involved in the kind of hands-on in terms of laying down materials for a particular building of a structure. It could be the person who's specialized standardized rather, and has a particular function in drafting the plans or ensuring kind of production management, and therefore making sure the processes go along at the right speed and to the right standards. But the standardization does in fact mean people become replaceable in some way. So when someone retires, when someone shifts out of a role, somebody else comes in to do that function. These roles have labels and titles that describe the function, and this particular image shows someone in a hard hat. There are protocols to follow, there's health and safety to follow. Maybe she has a number of builds to do in one day, and we can think about the ways in which people actually perform standardized roles. I was actually thinking of maybe when you see like a CPEP team at the side of the road, someone is cutting the grass, someone else is raking the grass, people are holding the shields. There is a manager actually monitoring the things that are going on in that small group, and making sure people are actually tending to the right area of land or grass. And therefore, when somebody doesn't show up on a particular day, if someone who's meant to be using the whacker isn't there for the day, they'll get somebody else to do it, and that is a particular function that they need to serve. And then the last image is of a dreaded office cubicle, and it's become the kind of nightmare image of automation. This idea that people are in roles that are predictable, there's a predictability, and that allows us to be able to see where problems arise. So if we have a particular function, if we have a particular process that we can think about in an organization, and something goes wrong, we can probably quite quickly say, okay, so the secretary sent the letter out to the wrong individual, or the manager asked for the letter to be drafted to the wrong person, and therefore the secretary just followed the instructions he or she was given, and it went out. And therefore you can indicate where the issue is, or was it somewhere further down the chain. So in a machine, when a part becomes broken, it becomes replaceable. So we can think about the ways in which other industries, not businesses, actually have these kinds of elements within them. I'm thinking of hospital environments in which there are departments and people serve very specific functions. Organisations like the university, in which there are administrative functions, there are teaching functions, there are information technology functions. There are all kinds of roles beyond the management of the individual courses to the management of the whole university, and seeking grants and funding and all of those kinds of things that go on at a university. We can think about government and policing. If you think about the police, there are very specific roles that people have, and they serve in different teams in different units. They are specialized. The function is standardized. The requirements of the job are actually written out and organized. And when a detective leaves, or an inspector leaves, or a corporal leaves, somebody else will have to come in at that particular level and perform those particular functions. So we can see that we're not just talking about business, of course, when we think about what the machine metaphor can tell us about the way about the way organization can function. In seeking to demystify the machine metaphor a little, to make sure that our minds are firmly on the notion that we're looking at human processes and people within organisation, and that's what we're really talking about, not the mechanized part of material business. I wanted to suggest that actually the human heart is equally good as a metaphor for the way classical theory can provide some explanation and modelling for the way we're thinking about organisation. So the human heart is a specialised organ. It's a pump, and it pumps a set volume of blood around the body at a certain rate according to physical challenges. It's predictable in the sense that each heart has various components that do certain things, and clinical sciences have developed tests that will indicate which part is going wrong and affecting the overall function. So I've actually put up some images of certain parts of the university that I think demonstrate the way classical theory provides an explanation of what's going on. If you think about the library situation, the fact that information is written down, it's available through a certain process of collection and depositing when you're done with it. There's a set amount of time that you can actually have a book for, or some resource for. It's predictable. There are predictable opening and closing hours, all of those kinds of things. If you think about tests as well, like the math test that's shown on the image, it's standardized, meaning that there are answers that are right and wrong, and the same tests can be applied to different classes and will indicate the certain knowledge retention or comprehension of a particular class. So tests are standardized and not so mysterious to us. We understand the function of them, and we understand some of the ways in which they work. And then the top image is it's probably a library, but it actually shows the way in which people come to a central place to do some work. There are set places where things happen, and there's a kind of ordering. It's not that people run about wherever they want and actually end up serving or performing certain tasks. Everything is predictable in a way. You can see how it works, and where to go to get certain things done. So let's look at Henry Fayol's theory of classical management. So one of the first things that Catherine Miller reminds us is that this is a prescriptive theory. A theory that is prescriptive actually indicates how something should be done. And so these kinds of theories that came about were really ways of explaining processes that happened in organisation, with the idea that this is the best way to do something because it has a positive impact on production. So Henry Fayol was actually French, and there is some deliberation when the work was translated whether we're actually talking about management or whether we're talking about administration. Because, if you pardon my French, the title was Administration Industrielle et Générale, the General Industrial Administration. It was published in 1916, and he was actually the director of a mining company in France with 1,000 or so employees. So he was very much interested in the way production happened and how to improve it. He's regarded as the father of modern operational management. So it's really the kind of managerial level that he was focused on in order to get production working well. And essentially he did a survey of how to improve managerial function and came up with this this model in which you can think about elements of management, so what managers actually do or should do, and then principles, how they should actually get the parts of the organization to actually work. So what they should do, and then how they should go about doing it. So now let's look a little bit at what FAYOL was talking about in terms of the detail of what managers should do and how they should go about doing them. One of the first things to say is the organisation organogram that you typically see in a classical organisation is one as seen on the slide in the top right hand corner. The fact that you have a central person who governs the organisation, and below them they would hire managers, and probably managers would have a number of supervisors, and then supervisors are responsible for teams, and within those teams or those small groups you might have team leaders, that kind of thing. So this is a kind of setup for a classical organisation, if you like. Now, what I've actually done in trying to explain FAYOL's theory is take it apart and simplify it. So if you actually look at a paper, a research paper that maybe uses classical theory to analyse a particular organisation, or you go to Catherine Miller's text, you'll see, you know, a few more elements than the ones that I've put on this slide. However, I think these are the key things, and so these are the ones I wanted to talk about today. And of course, you'll get more information in various resources that you see in this course and from outside. So key elements. What managers should do: should be involved in planning. So they're the ones who determine what resources go to whom and how they're used. So we've said resources and methods. The organising, they're the ones who actually give the employees certain tasks, and also would measure how well they're doing. And then they actually have some kind of controlling function. And they're the ones who set the tasks and actually, you know, determine what it is that needs to be done. The principles, how it should be done. I've actually just focused on three particular principles. One is the Scala chain, the idea that communication should work according to a vertical hierarchy. So the idea is that if someone in a team has a particular issue, they send that to their or speak to their manager about it, send it up the chain. It's not that they would go directly to the CEO, because the CEO probably doesn't, you know enough about this particular team and what it does. It certainly doesn't, you know, he or she probably doesn't know the employee in a big organization. And, you know, it's just not their function to get involved in the nitty-gritty, because they're involved in something else. So it means that in a classical organisation, the person you speak to is someone who's probably known to you and involved in that chain, and then the manager would take it up the chain to various other people who have certain kinds of authority and certain kinds of knowledge and specialist understanding in order to actually help you know, deal with a particular complaint or situation. Centralized decision making is actually connected to power, and that was one of the key principles of how managers should go about operating the organization. So we can think of many different ways in which power is centralized in a classical organization. And it just means that if you think about the managers coming down a chain, if you like, to employees, or the particular functions at various levels, they are getting more and more specialized. So the company itself may have a particular motto or a particular approach to actually organizing the company and the work that needs to be done, and then the teams may have specific objectives and they would have to be achieved in certain ways, and then employees may have specific functions within that team to perform a certain task. So we have the idea that power is centralized, We can think about the way government works and how the Office of the Prime Minister is actually a centralising power centre. It's a centralised power function, and everything needs to go through this particular office in order for it to be coordinated. The third thing to say about how managers should work and the kinds of attitude that should be inculcated and encouraged is the idea that the organisation comes first, and it's not meaning that people don't have value as individuals. It's simply meaning that we're all as individuals in the company working to a common goal, and it is our goal in an organisation to try and do all we can to maintain its reputation to a certain degree, because we're all party to that organisation, and if it crumbles, it means we're all impacted in various ways. So the letters in brackets, S, P and A, refer to structure and the idea that there's a structural hierarchy in terms of the way communication functions. P refers to power. Power is centralised. And A refers to attitude. And this idea of all for one is something that managers are encouraged to kind of instigate and promote with employees in this classical management structure. All right, so let's move on a little bit and look at Max Weber's theory of bureaucracy. He was the first person to coin this idea, and when we think of bureaucracy, we actually think about the ways in which organisations are run internally, and in the ways in which the administration actually serves to construct an organisation and make it function. Weber came up with 6 facets of bureaucracy, and 3 of them are familiar from FAYOL. So hierarchy, the division of labour and centralisation in yellow, we have already attended to a certain degree by considering the way FAYOL actually thought about the role of individual managers in organisation and the way managers should function. And then we have 3 more: the closed system, the written explicit rules, and the functioning of authority. Now, a closed system is one that means the individuals are shut off from a certain external environment. Thompson in '67 called it technical cause. We can think about technical cause, if you like that term, in terms of the ways in which teams become isolated within organisation. So you can have small groups within an organisation that actually serve particular functions. Maybe they serve policy, maybe they're involved in delivering certain tasks, or they are involved in a particular part of the process. And they work together, they communicate in a certain way, they have a certain kind of technical language, and therefore you could understand why the ideas of them forming a unit actually make sense, and they're not kind of disrupted by the external environment. I was looking for a communication example to think about a closed system, and I think the idea of small groups within an organisation, you could think of all kinds of things like a bank or, as I said, the police. There are particular units within them that function in a certain way, and maybe there's a privacy issue or a kind of information intelligence issue, meaning that you don't want those teams mixing with other people to share information. They mix with other people, but their information and their work is separate and apart. So we can also think about written rules, and one of the things that I hope was clear from the work that we did in tutorial was the fact that in a hierarchical organisation, often you'll have rules that are actually written, and maybe you spoke about this in your tutorial group, but the fact that if you think about the university, for example, there is a benefit for the organisation to actually writing down things, codifying them, systematizing them, and putting them in one place. It means that everyone gets access to the same information. It means there is supposed to be little confusion as to, you know, what is being said, because it's stated in one place and everyone has access to it. And you get things like frequently asked questions in organisation, where you can actually do searches for commonly asked questions, and if you can't find your answer, then you go about seeking a one-to-one answer. But much of the information is going to be there, or at least that's the thinking. Let's think about the way in which an organisation works when you call up and there's an automated system. I think from a user point of view, that kind of communication can feel quite impersonal, and this is one of the downsides, of course. It can feel like you're not actually getting through to somebody. You have to listen to a set of information that perhaps doesn't pertain to you, or stuff you already know, before you get to the answer you want. However, the benefit for the organisation and for you as the recipient of the information are the things that I've already stated. Now, the last thing to think about is this idea of authority, and it is that within an organisation, some body or some unit, some individual role has to serve as the authority. There has to be a way in which people can actually look for the information and find clear instructions about what it is that's required of them. Otherwise, nothing really gets done. If there isn't that organisation, then we start to have problems and things start to break down. So let's have a quick look at when Weber was talking about functioning of authority, the kinds of things that he actually was thinking about. So he divided authority and the way it functions into 3 different types, and I've put some images here that should be readily understood. We can have this idea of traditional or legitimate authority vested in a certain kind of position, and I've got this picture of the crown to indicate the way the role of the monarch or the queen, certainly the Queen of England, functions. It's bestowed on her, and then the first in line to the throne, and it it has this kind of association with privilege, and it can be problematic, certainly in an organisation. But you find ways in which there's traditional authority that functions when it's a family-owned business and somebody in the family takes over. They're the one who gets to manage the business afterwards. It's not like it's available to anyone to apply for the job. It's a small business, and that's how it works. We can look at charismatic authority, and I've put these 2 pictures here, one of Dr. Williams and one of Basteo Pandey. They were both in their own way said to be highly charismatic leaders. A charismatic leader is someone who actually leads through personality. They're able to encourage people to work around them and follow their ideas. Charismatic leadership is often associated with this idea of cult leadership, and or cult leaders rather are said to be charismatic because they manage to get people to follow their ideas and latch on to what they believe in. Then you get this rational, legal type of authority, and this is based on reliance of information and expertise. So a judge, for example, is an authority because a judge is the person in whom the authority is bestowed to adjudicate on law and pass down a final verdict. It's not that the judge has unlimited power and can decide what he or she wishes to do. It is that the power is legitimated by that judge following certain kinds of norms and having an obedience to the rules and regulations. So when we follow a legal or rational or legal kind of authority, we're actually following the norms, not the person. So that's why you will see a memo, for example, signed from an office of the Prime Minister, for example, or from a particular authority within an organisation. It's not so much that it's signed by the individual, or at least the individual does occupy that role, but it's only for a certain time, and then that power gets passed down to somebody else. So Weber saw rational legal as dominating bureaucratic organisations. So the first two rely on people, and the third one relies on an authority that comes through bureaucracy. And bureaucratic organisations, let's think, say, of government, which has to run in a particular way, and it transitions to new people once people are voted out of office. The kind of authority that's behind the government that we see is the public service. That is highly bureaucratic. There are very specific roles that people serve, and when they move on, that office becomes vacated and somebody else has to fill that role. And so we can think of bureaucratic organisations as being highly rational in that way. And the other thing to say about bureaucratic organisations is that they're dominated through the knowledge. So this gives them their rationality, if you like, and the knowledge has to be passed down, and often it's written, but it needs to be learned by somebody in a particular function who can then actually carry out the role from someone that they've assumed the authority from. Before we move on, let's do a quick review of what we've been saying so far. So a theory is developed as an explanation that fits a certain kind of evidence. Theories are not closed in the sense that researchers continue to work from particular theoretical orientations and building upon theories, and therefore adding data and explanation. We can talk about inductive research that actually develops a particular theoretical orientation, and deductive that continues to add evidence to particular research. So classical theory is like any other theory. This is an umbrella term that's used to explain a body of work. We're just looking at three particular theorists under that banner of classical theory. And what we can say is that there are current researchers who are actually leaning on classical theory, meaning that they're using it as their starting point for an orientation to examine a particular operation or organisation. And then they will add their work, and it will therefore expand the way we can talk about what is a classical theory. By adding new paradigms and new approaches and new explanations for why things are working in the ways that they are. So theory is not fixed. The three theorists that we've looked at have provided us with some seminal ideas about the way communication works within organisation. We've also said that the classical organisations that we're talking about, or that were worked on by FAYOL, Weber, and you'll hear Taylor, those kinds of organisations that were used to provide the data are just three types of organisation, and we can see classical theoretical explanations working when we look at organisations, as I said, like the police, big industry, the university, organisations that have these kind of big layered operations and many different kind of specializations within the organization, so hospitals included, for example. So it's not that it's something static and turn of the century, industrial revolution, and therefore has no application today. It completely does. And in fact, the theories being developed in the way that they were as prescriptive theories have given us some of the rules and regulations that people will use in order to build organisation today, thinking that this is the best way to work. So that's something to bear in mind. It has a very contemporary resonance. All right, so let's just go back to what we've been saying. We can use the human heart as a way of thinking about the way classical theory defines organisation. This idea of specialisation, as we said, standardisation and predictability. We can look at the theories of Max Weber to also talk about the way, as well as having a kind of hierarchy in an organisation and, you know, division of labour, centralised authority, we have this idea of closed systems, which applies to teams today that are kept isolated for particular reasons. Maybe in a police organisation we'll have an isolated unit, or in banking we have an isolated unit that actually tests and monitors the operations of the organisation. So those people would tend to be, you know, their information is tending to be kept separate because it is a monitoring system within the organisation. We have this idea of written rules and regulations, as we've said, that come from Max Weber's ideas of classical organisation and the ways in which it will function best. And then we spoke about the different kinds of authority based on, you know, personality, tradition, and rules and regulations that are set out. So let's now look at the theories of Frederick Taylor and his theory of scientific management in particular. I just want to read for you again from Catherine Miller, in which she says, Taylor is not concerned with organisational structure in the way that FAYOL was, but more with the relationship between the manager and the employee. So he was really interested in this micro level, whereas we can say FAYOL, his theorization and thinking was really about the big kind of structural movements in an organisation that actually have it working in the way that it should work, according to him. So Taylor was an American businessman and came up with this prescriptive theory of scientific management. He actually started measuring the way people operated in business and was very concerned with rates of production and that kind of thing, and also how to actually improve the training so that somebody would actually be able to, you know, do a particular role at maximum efficiency. So he was actually frustrated by those two things. Apprenticeship, you know, if a senior was inefficient, then he would train someone junior to him in an inefficient way. And he was also very concerned with the productive worker. So for an hourly job, if that person was actually efficient, a manager might decrease the rate to, you know, so it didn't cost the organisation as much. So there was a social pressure in effect to reduce productivity rather than increase productivity, and that was something that obviously concerned him. So if you look at this slide, we can see that what he did was he came up with time and motion studies, and I think he was actually working in a brick production plant, and so he was very concerned with the manufacturing of bricks and the use of bricks and how to kind of mechanize these kinds of organizations. How do you go about selecting workers and ensuring that they are getting good training and that they are incentivized, they are motivated to actually work better and not decrease their rate of production because, you know, of fear that they get so efficient that it causes the business to think, well, this is not working in our favor. And so he was concerned as well with this division of labour, which we've already spoken about, where you have very specialised roles. So this is one of the places in the lecture where I'm just going to talk for a moment and then suggest you take a look at this video by clicking on the link that I'm going to include below. This short clip is a TED talk by Atul Gawande, who in 2009 wrote the Checklist Manifesto. He's actually a surgeon who was recruited to look at the way medical inefficiencies were producing really poor rates of success in surgery. And essentially I'm including it to indicate to you the fact that classical theory actually provides us with the theoretical orientation for the way a communication process works, in this case in an organisation like a hospital setting and in a particular process. And he explains very well the ways in which he went about the research and actually helped improve the way something works by systematizing it. Now, systematization is actually something that we might rebel against because we think that it's this idea of, putting people in boxes and structuring roles around them in a way that kind of hampers creativity. And that's definitely a downside. That's definitely one of the cons. So we can always talk about pros and cons of all of these communication processes, but systematization in this particular application seems to be something that has a value. So take a look and come back to the lecture afterwards. So I, for one, found the Gawande speech really interesting, and the fact that he was saying that systematization, so taking a process-driven approach to looking at human activity within an organisation, has important benefits within surgery. So again, as I say, this is classical theory in operation. We can see the way it can be used as a lens to consider a particular process in an organisation, a communication process. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the explicit communication facets when we actually use this lens of classical theory to consider systematization. The theory explains, as I said, it allows us to define experiences through a particular understanding and therefore predict outcomes. So one of the things that classical theory actually leads us to, having considered the idea of the hierarchy, having considered the idea of specialization and standardization, are the fact that we can talk about goals of an organization opposed to individual needs. As I mentioned earlier, this idea of reputation and the fact that the classical theories actually provide us with this notion that thinking about the organization is actually going to be a more productive way of working, is going to be a better way of working, because we then become subsumed in the organization, as it were, and the reputation we need to maintain is that of the organization. And so our individual problems perhaps can disappear. It's why in government, even though we try to pin down problems to individual ministers, governments tend to like to talk about, this government and what it's doing, because it doesn't want us to focus on the individuals so much as the overarching direction of a particular party or group of parties who have formed the government. So let's look at goals of an organization. And these three researchers, Farace, Mon and Russell, actually came up with the idea of goals being organized in a particular way around task, innovation and maintenance related. And maintenance related actually refers to the maintenance of relationships, of human relationships. So we can talk about the ways in which goals are structured in an organization in terms of being a specific task. We can clearly imagine the ways in which task is a service or an actual product. We don't have to think very far, as I said, when thinking about classical organisations, in terms of the way police provide a service, banking provides a service, a manufacturing plant provides a service and ultimately produces a particular physical product that we're interested in. There are companies or organisations that actually focus on innovation, and their function and their focus on goals is really about what is the latest or newest thing coming out. And we can think about all of the kind of technology companies that we're probably all too familiar with, and social media companies, in terms of, you know, providing new platforms, new approaches for us to communicate, for example. And then as I said, we can look at the maintenance of human relationships in organisations that classical theory reveals to be the structure, built into the structure of how communication works best. Social communication is actually discouraged. So, as I was saying when we were talking about FAYOL and the Scala chain, we have this idea that communication has to happen up a vertical hierarchy. He actually did talk about what was called FAYOL's bridge, which is an explanation for the way communication happens horizontally in an organisation. That means one team on the same level talks to another team, and it is actually part of the communication process. But when anything needs to change, when anything needs to be given instruction in order to develop or evolve, that needs to go up the chain. It can't be a horizontal communication. So in organizations that promote the hierarchy for communication, the classical theory would predict less innovation related discussion, because the innovation, as one can imagine, would actually develop rather when people are actually talking across their teams and working across different departments, or working with colleagues who are, specialized in other areas. So this is one of the ironies, perhaps, of thinking about the way something happens in a university, the way communication happens and produces innovation in a university. In some ways, because of the way the university is structured, people are working in departments. How then does an organization seek to encourage communication that promotes innovation? Well, they do it in different ways, by actually having to encourage cross-fertilization of ideas and cross-discussion. The idea that spaces are provided where people can share ideas. Maybe there are incentives that are provided in terms of grants or competitions, or workshops. At universities, of course, there are conferences to encourage this kind of cross-fertilization of ideas. So we have ways in which, because of a classical organization structure and the idea of hierarchy, we actually have to create other structures, other communication processes, in order to encourage communication across groups and across teams. So let's just move on now, and we're coming towards the end of the lecture. But let's just think a little bit about what we've said about communication and it working up this vertical chain, up this hierarchy. Classical organization also encourages us to think about writing that is formal in some ways, because the channel of communication in a classical organization, as I said, is often written, because rules and regulations need to be posted in a place and they need to be systematized, they need to be codified, which means they have a particular structure and they're written down and they're organized in a very kind of clear, logical, sequential way. So the tendency of face-to-face communication that we might prefer is actually mediated by the technology. So people send emails, they write things down, because there needs to be a chain to indicate who said what to whom, to what effect. So we can also understand quite clearly why it is that we have things like memos that come about, which are formally written. They have a very definite structure. It's not just a casual piece of writing. The language is formal, and the idea is that this is very much part of the organisational construction. Now, in the first lecture, when we were talking about communication that is constitutive of organisation, this is an example of that. The memo and its formal structure, the fact that the ideas are written down and signed off by a title holder rather than maybe an individual name, are all ways in which we can see the classical theory being embodied and being applied to the organisation and constructing the organisation and therefore constituting it. So if you're in a casual organisation where you'd normally have face-to-face communication that didn't have these big structures and wasn't maybe a big organisation, it would seem odd to be sending a memo to somebody. Equally, you couldn't have an organisation run efficiently, a big organisation run efficiently, if everything was, just face-to-face communication and conversation. If it wasn't written down in some way, there'd be no way of verifying what was said and what instructions were given. So we can see the ways in which there are pros and cons to these things, and the ways in which they actually serve to build the organisation and not just emerge from it. So, as we've been saying, the evidence of classical organisational structure is all around us. We can think about the factories, fast food restaurants, online registration as a process that of systematisation. In a fast food restaurant like KFC, we can think about the ways in which there is a production line, people have very specific jobs, and we expect a certain kind of standard and product that is the same each time we go into a restaurant like that. So we can see the benefits of having these processes that emerge from and are explained by classical theory, and we all, of course, also know probably the downsides of it and have experienced those. So I want to leave us with a short video about the history of classical theory as a way of helping concretize how these theories emerged and what they can tell us about operation today and the way organisations actually work today. I'm looking forward, along with my colleague Greer, to work with you in tutorial to better understand classical theory and the applications that emerge out of this kind of idea of the way organisations work. Many thanks.